Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and just excited to share that I am coming to you from the Sifriya Halaumit. So interesting in life to be in different places. So this is our first shiur on Sanhedrin. I want to look at the concept of Peshara, right? The concept of mediation or compromise, something that isn't just strict din. And I want to give us a sense, because we have this beautiful discussion, this beautiful breita about whether Peshara is something that is terrible or something that is great. Or like, I just want to understand what Peshara is about, right? Like what's the big idea behind Peshara, I would say. And I'm going to offer us three different reads of the reason to employ a Peshara rather than a din. But I actually want to start with a more basic question. And the more basic question is the question of whether Peshara itself is actually kind of din, right? Or do we say that it's in a different category altogether? Now, there are practical nafkaminas or hashlachot. There are practical consequences to whether you consider Peshara to be din. For example, can you do Peshara with two judges rather than three judges, whereas with din you need three? Can you have rove majority, or do you need full unanimity for Peshara, right? There are a bunch of things that would practically, it would make a difference. But I also want to think ideationally, kind of philosophically. Do we think that Peshara is a kind of din itself? And for that, I just want to start with the question of where Peshara is sourced. Like, actually, what is its makor, right? Or makor. So I want to start with the Gemara in Sanhedrin that, God willing, you will learn in a few weeks. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Lamed Bet, Amud Bet. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Lamed Bet, Amud Bet, talks about the fact that there are two psukim that seem to push us to judge bitzedek, right? We have bitzedek tishpot amitecha, right, in Vayikra, and we have tzedek tzedek tirdof in Devarim. So Reish Lakish is credited with saying, "Haketzad, how do we reconcile the need for these two? Kan bidin mirumeh, kan bidin she'eno mirumeh." Right? If you're in a trial that you think might have some funny business going on, then tzedek tzedek tirdof. You've got to pursue justice. You have to really interrogate. You have to really peel back the layers. But if you have a din that you don't think is mirumeh, everything's going fine, then tzedek tishpot amitecha. With tzedek, you should judge your fellow, right? Rav Ashi says, actually, and I'm just skipping a couple of words because it's more contextual, says, Kroi echad ledin vechad lepshara. One of those psukim is for din, I would guess, b'tzedek tishpot amitecha. And the other pasuk is about pshara, right? Tzedek, tzedek. Maybe you're going lifnim mishurat din, maybe, right? One would be for pshara. So it's interesting to consider that maybe what would be the relationship if you had two different psukim, one pasuk that teaches you din and one pasuk that teaches you pshara. It's possible to think that these really are two disparate ways of doing things, right? And in fact, the Yad Ramah, who is a parish on Sanhedrin that is, you will see quoted many, many times and hear quoted many, many times. The Yad Ramah says the fact that there are two different psukim tells me that din is not pshara and pshara is not din, and they have different halachot. But then you have a breita that comes right after that in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which says tzedek tzedek tirdof. It says kiditanya, like we learn in a breita, tzedek tzedek tirdof, echad ledin ve'echad lepshara. It sounds like it's saying one tzedek is for din and one tzedek is for pshara. So maybe actually both din and pshara come from tzedek tzedek tirdof, meaning they actually come from exactly the same place, which is what Rashi says, lifni mishurat hadin, it's going to be pshara. So I just want to start off even from the question itself. I think part of what we're really asking is din about getting to the kind of ironclad, uncompromised truth? Or can din also be about something else? So I want to spend a few minutes talking about what is that something else. So let's say I'm not going to be able to be machriya. I'm not going to be able to decide whether we think that pshara is a kind of din or not based on what I'm about to do. But regardless of whether pshara is a kind of din or is not a kind of din, I want to think about what pshara actually is trying to accomplish. So it turns out that Rashi really thinks, at least Rashi ala Torah, when you look in Devarim, Perek Vav, Pasuk Chet, V'asita yashar v'atov b'nei Hashem, leman yitav lach, you should do what's right and good in the eyes of God, so that it will be well for you. Uvata v'yarashta ta'aretz atova asher nishba Hashem lavotecha, so you can come and possess the land that God swore to your ancestors. So Rashi says, yashar v'hatov, what is the right and the good? So pshara, it is pshara. Lifnim mishurat hadin, within the line of the law. Now, I've talked about this before. People love to say above and beyond, but a teacher of mine, Professor Christine Hayes, taught me, Lifnim mishurat hadin, no, think about it. Your rights extend up to a particular line. If you go over that line, it's an avira. You are overet. You are transgressing over the line. And if you take less than your rights allow, you are lifnim mishurat hadin. You're giving up. You're staying within the line, even more, giving up what you're able to have, right? So in a way, you know what we call this? We call this equity, right? Equity essentially is when we say, look, the usual ruling is X, but in situation Y, it's going to cause a really bad outcome. And what we need to do is we need to fundamentally change the way we're perceiving justice here. So I'll give an example. And I saw this example in Rabbi Howard Jachter, who I often read. You know, he has these Kol Torah articles online. I often read him on things that have to do with practical Beit Din. He runs a Beit Din in New Jersey, and things that have to do with practical Batei Din. I often read what he writes in his Kol Torah articles. And he mentioned an example that in the name of Rav Soloveitchik, of a woman who, a maid who lent an expensive family jewel or heirloom or something to their employer for the employer's child's wedding, and the employer lost it. And it's interesting because halachically speaking, the employer was considered, you know, yes, the employer was considered a shoelet, someone who was borrowing, but they also were employing the person they were borrowing from at the same time, which meant that technically they were exempt from paying. But mishum pshara, or really equity, to make things fair, the ruling was that the employer should pay 90% of the worth of the jewel that was lost. So there, what you see is there's an inequity caused by the way things would go. And as a result, vasita yashar v'atov, yes, it's true. By rights, you could go all the way up to the line and not pay anything. But you're saying, I'm not going to take all of my rights. I'm going to give more of it. Now, when you look at that, do you say that's part of din? Do you say that's something separate from din? I think you could look at it either way, right? Like, how beautiful would it be if equity was actually part of din itself? But also, how dangerous would it be if equity is part of din itself? Because then you can't actually distinguish between what the transparent, what's the word? Anticipated, obvious line of the law is, and some decision that's going to be made because, you know, equity is 90%, it's 80%, it's 50% that you should have to pay, right? It's a little bit more subjective. That's one way of looking at pshara. It's to right a bad outcome. Another way to look at pshara is to look at it as mediation, in the sense that it's not that the outcome is going to be objectively unfair or wrong. It's that the people are just not going to accept it. It's just not going to work. And I saw this in Rav Shmuel Mohilever, and I was so excited to see this because I was just reading Rav Mohilever as an early religious Zionist pioneer. So it was really cool to read him as, you know, a posek. So in his Tshuvot, he mentions, he's in 19th century Europe, In his Tshuvot, he says, V'chein haminhag pashut b'chol beit din shebi Yisrael. It is a clear custom in all batei din in the Jewish people, she'im ro'im la'achar hapsak sheyuchlu lavo mizeh lidei ktata umiriva, that if you see, and I'm not sure what he means here, if he's saying, because it can't be, once there's Gemar Din, you can't do a Peshara anymore. So what does he mean by, is it that they see that after the Psak, they're going to fight these two litigants, or is it once they've decided in their heads what the Psak is? It's not clear to me what he means by that. But if you see that they're going to come, lidek tata umiriva, they're going to fight, but it's more than that. Ve'efshar gam l'seruv, maybe they'll come to refuse to carry out the decision of the court. Ubitul hapsak din bichlalo, maybe they will completely nullify the psak din. Ki yad Yisrael einat tkefa ka'et lahamid hadin Torah al tilo b'chol tokef. We don't have the jurisdiction at this point. Remember, he's not living in, a Jewish state. We don't have the jurisdiction to ensure that they're actually going to listen. So we actually have to care about whether they're going to refuse to abide by the court's decision. And if we see that that's what's going to happen, mifaisim et habaldin sheyivater al ma lebaldino, we basically try to appease and try to sort of like work with one of the balidin, one of the litigants, to be willing to give something up to the other litigant, the kol ish al mekomo yavo b'shalom, so that everybody goes back happy, right? Or at least peaceful, right? This is interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is really the right thing that should be done, right? Meaning, I think it's interesting to consider that if you look at Peshara as equity, I actually in some ways could see that that's more part of din, because din also wants the result to be good. Here, mediation, it's a little bit like, okay, so if these people happen to be incredibly hard-headed, right, but other people would have been fine with this outcome, then you should do Peshara. That feels a little bit more like we're actually just trying to keep the integrity of the court intact, right? Does that have to do with din? Does that have to do with this decision that's being made? Not necessarily. So maybe there I would split them more and say Peshara is one thing and din is another thing, right? So that's a second reason that arises why people, or a second explanation. Now, these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. It could be sometimes you're doing it for equity, sometimes you're doing it for mediation, but it's just good to get a little bit of like some layers of meaning and understanding under Peshara, so that it's not just this flat idea. There's another perspective on Peshara that I think is equally fascinating, which is no. Peshara is not about the litigants per se. It's actually because we're not sure we're going to get the right din. So we'd rather everybody agree to Peshara to begin with. And so even if we're wrong, it's fine. So the Shulchan Aruch says, right? Judges should not say we're judging a din Torah, right? They should try as much as possible not to do that. And people say, the Vilna Gaon among them, that the source for this is in the Yerushalmi, and this is just so magnificent. Okay, so the Yerushalmi says, Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta, Atan Train bar Nash Medon Kamoy. So two litigants came before him for a judgment before Rabbi Yossi bar Chalafta. Relay, they said to him, Al menach didinenu din Torah, right? This is only on condition that you are going to judge us by the law of the Torah. Amar Lon, he said to them, Ani eni odea din Torah, right? He says, I don't really know what the law of the Torah is going to be. Ela hayodea machshavot yipara me otan ha'anashim. Says, but the one who knows all machshavot, who knows all thoughts, Hashem, right, will, should collect from the people who should be collected from, right? So it says, Mekablina lechon madina amar lechon. You just have to accept that what I'm going to tell you, right? Meaning the point is, maybe sometimes we say we want you to accept Peshara because we're actually worried that we won't be able to do the right thing. And then the Yerushalmi continues, Rabbi Akiva, Karhava Barnash, Ozo Bo Maiden Kome, Hava Amarle. When people would come to get a judgment before Rabbi Akiva, he would say, Have we Yodin Lifnei Miatem Omdim? Know before whom you stand. lifnei mi shamar vayala, before the one who spoke and the world was created. Shenemar v'amdu shnei ha'anashim asher lahem hariv lifnei Hashem, that those who are, right, our biblical source, those who are having their fight shall stand before God. Below lifnei Akiva ben Yosef, you are before God and not before me. I think that is just magnificent. And then it goes one step further, which is Tani Kodim la'arba'im shana, right? 40 years, ad shelo charev habayit, before the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, nitlu dinei nefashot, the ability to carry out capital cases was removed from the Jewish people. Okay. Now, people explain that this is when Judea comes under the rule of Rome. Okay. And then it says, Uvimei Shimon ben Shetach nitlu dinei mamonot. And in the time of Shimon ben Shetach, although scholars say it's probably not in the time of Shimon ben Shetach, there's actually another version of this Breita where it actually seems to be in the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but leave that as it may. Also, dinei mamonot was taken, right? So they can't really do, they can't really do the real thing, so to speak. And then Amar Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Brich Rachmana Dili Nachachim Midon. He says, blessed be Hashem because I'm not wise enough to judge, right? This is my favorite version of Peshara, to basically say, meaning it's my favorite and it's also a little bit complicated, right? It's my favorite because that's kind of the humility. I actually really do think that there should be in a religious system serious humility in being judges. And I think you will find that throughout the Masechet, that there are places where we are mistagim, we are holding ourselves back. And to the extent that we'd rather you be agreeing to an arbitration that we don't necessarily think is always going to be 100% right, but you're agreeing to abide by it, that is a way of showing humility. And in fact, the arbitration agreements, I think in the Beit Din of America, they say you can find them online. They say it might be according to Peshara, it might be according to Din. I even think it says it might be Peshara Krova Ladin, Peshara that's close to Din, which could be another topic for us to discuss. But the point is, we're not assuming that we know everything, right? So take any of those three. Equity, we want to make sure that things are fair. Mediation, we want to make sure that people are not going to keep on fighting afterwards and maybe even ignore the court, or we're not necessarily sure that what we're going to say is right. Beautiful. 3 different reasons for Peshara. Now, did any of those tell us whether Peshara is part of Din or not part of Din? I feel this one, Peshara, is not part of Din. I think they are very, very different. The only one for me that really stands out is like Peshara could really be part of Din, to me, is really the equity piece, because I think, Din wants to get at something that is right and just. Maybe the mediation, but I'm not. I think less so. That's what I think. Okay. Either way, you can't really, in my opinion, learn about Peshara without reading some Rav Soloveitchik on the topic. First of all, this isn't the example, like this isn't the source that I'm giving you, but there is a place where, and maybe I should have given it, maybe we'll include it in the sources, where Rav Soloveitchik talks about how he thinks actually Peshara is a kind of din, and it's, it's really accomplishing it's accomplishing truth in a different way. But here he does something a little bit different. And I think it's really worth considering. And it does take into account, to my mind, kind of all of these perspectives, the equity and the mediation and the, not sure we're going to get it right. Okay. And here he's making a big red line between Din and Peshara. Okay. Din pits one party against the other. The Dayan analyzes the relevant facts of the case and applies the appropriate legal sanctions as described by Choshen Mishpat. The law is administrated with cold impartiality and its decisions are dictated by objective data. One party emerges the victor, their case vindicated. The plea of the other is denied. Discord and resentment persist, even as the court docket is cleared and the case is closed. The legal issue has been resolved, but human bitterness continues to fester. In Peshara, however, social harmony is the primary concern of the Dayan. The fine points of the law and the determination of precise facts are of secondary importance. The goal is not to be judicially astute, but to be socially healing. The psychology of the contenders, their social economic status and value, as well as the general temper of society, are the primary ingredients employed in the Peshara process. These considerations are evaluated within the broad halachic parameters of Choshen Mishpat, and the final resolution of the conflict is a delicate and sensitive blending of both objective legal norms and subjective humanistic goals. For this reason, Peshara is the preferred alternative. Peshara is a juridical procedure presided over by the Dayan. It does not contradict the law, but it is preferred. It is its preferred and finest fulfillment, right? So look at what he did there. He starts by saying, big red line between din and Peshara. Din is only interested in the cold, hard facts. Peshara is only interested in the, kind of the harmony of it. And then he's like, well, actually, the best version of din is actually something that melds them both, right? And I think in general, like if we were to ask ourselves some questions about what is din? These are the oldest questions in jurisdiction conversations. What is din? To what extent are you using subjective factors? And to what extent is, the law a machine and you put in your boop, 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 and what comes out will be the same every single time. And I think to an extent, Peshara is an example of something that potentially opens din to a whole slew of factors that aren't necessarily just on the page, at least of the individual statute. But that remains to be seen. Let's see as we go on. But at the very least, we've started the conversation about Peshara. And maybe we'll continue it another time when it comes up, maybe on Lamed Bet. Thanks, everybody.